Okay, so yeah, my name is April. Welcome to my presentation on needs assessment and resource development for the Nunavut Breakfast Program Guidebook. So this guidebook serves as a reference for all school food programs within Nunavut, and just about every school has one. I am a grateful resident of Inuit Nunangat in Iqaluit, Nunavut. I had two lovely supervisors, Alison McCreary and Amy Coggy, because that is just life here. And so nobody was actually able to supervise the whole thing. And so thank you also to Jaime and Kathy for all your help, especially Kathy had to deal with a lot of the wiggling that happened in Iqaluit over the last little while. Yeah, so here we go. So just to give you kind of an introduction as to what we were doing here. So every school within Nunavut provides a breakfast program for their students, basically a hot or a cold meal. However, the scope and service of these programs can differ quite a bit. And so why do we care about school food programs? Nearly 70% of Inuit preschoolers are food insecure. It's a huge issue within Nunavut. Food insecurity is then correlated with risk of chronic disease like diabetes, increased stress, higher risk of mood and anxiety disorders. School food programs can actually both improve eating habits at home and at school, so thereby improving overall health. They can also improve academic performance and reduce self-reported learning difficulties. So one thing that was really cool that came up is some of the teachers actually noted that the whole tone of the school would change depending if it was a food provision day or not. However, school food programs are hard to run. Staff turnover and training is a big issue. There's a lot of difficulty sourcing food, especially in remote areas. A lot of the communities in Nunavut only actually have 1 or 2 stores, and they're very small. Capacity, we actually have growing populations in our communities here, but they are still very small. And financial restraints are kind of the main issues. In Nunavut as well, school food programs are usually run by a mix of teachers and volunteers, so there's not a lot of time or expertise with large-scale food service. So luckily, there were several assessments already in place. So first off, we have the school food program summary report, which was by the Department of Education. And we also had the food programs in Nunavut schools knowledge project interview summary report. Bit of a mouthful, that one was done by the Department of Health. We also had notes from the community nutritionists who go to the schools and would just informally chat with members of the staff, volunteers, et cetera, and kind of get some notes from them. As well as some request forms, essentially wish lists from the school programs themselves. So basically the idea behind this project was to figure out how we could best assist with what the schools actually needed. Because we had this Nunavut School Breakfast Program Guidebook, but it wasn't updated for about 10 years. It was last done in 2013, and there was definitely some issues with it and some information missing. So we wanted to see what we could do to kind of bulk it up to make it more helpful to the people running these programs. So we compiled all the issues and recommendations that came up from all these assessments into a single doc, and then a working group was developed to identify major problems and ideally potential solutions. So we were very lucky in that 43 out of 43 school food programs actually responded to the Department of Education assessment. It's required for funding. We had pretty good stakeholder input through that, as well as our illustrious working group, which included some territorial nutritionists, it included some teachers, it included some other Department of Health and Department of Education staff. So we were very lucky with that. However, Iqaluit has been in a bit of a rocky period for the last 6 months. There was a water crisis in October, November, where our water plant was contaminated with fuel. So everybody was going to the river for their water, and the military was here and everything. And then we were kind of last to join the COVID train. And so there was a lot going on. And people were doing 3 different jobs at any given time, and then, also having to truck off to the river to get their water. So feedback was sometimes kind of limited, understandably. There's also the potential for some missing and replicated replies, because everybody replied to the one, but it might be that somebody else would reply in every other instance and somebody else wouldn't reply at all. So different schools probably had different levels of feedback. So we came up with the main recommendations. First off, was the format. Books get lost. There's crazy staff turnover. It wasn't really working because nobody could find the book. So we decided maybe a phone app or website or design or something like that would probably be a better option for actually getting this information to the teachers who need it. We found that the biggest issues, or what people wanted most, was how to build a budget, which includes costing. How much do things cost? Staff, food, equipment, all that. The idea of a standing order. So you can imagine in a very small town, if a school comes in and says, I need to buy 50 apples, they clean out the apple section of that store, and now your community actually doesn't have any apples. So that could actually happen. Whole stores would be wiped out because of the order, because the store didn't know what to order, and so they didn't get enough, and now the school has taken from the community. Food safety issues for both country food and store-bought. So our food program guidebook was built off the Nunavut food guide, at least to an extent. So we have our own. It incorporates country food, which is the traditional food, narwhal, muktak, char, stuff like that. But a lot of the teachers and a lot of the volunteers are non-Inuit, known as Kalunat, who don't necessarily know the safe or best ways to prepare these foods. We also needed just some basic information, kitchen needs, scaling. How do you choose and scale a recipe if you don't really have any training in food service? Fair enough. So the first thing we realized was the budget was actually not nearly as complicated as we thought. Luckily, it was by far the biggest concern, and more than half of school food programs felt they didn't have enough funding and ended up compromising food quality toward the end of the year because they were running out of money. So they were applying for money through different sources. The actual original request was, please help us complete applications for all these different funders. However, we realized that was totally unnecessary. All school food programs can actually get all the funding they need through the Nunavut Wellness Agreement. People just didn't know how much they needed, and so they weren't necessarily applying for the whole amount and therefore running out partway. So this is where we needed to figure out what our costs were. So we needed to determine how much funding was needed for an annual school food program so people could apply all at once for the funding they actually needed. We compiled a list of food prices, equipment prices, staff salaries to figure out how much everything would cost. We included wants versus needs. So like your new appliances, foods for a hypothetical lunch program, anything you could possibly want. So I don't actually have that one picture. This is a different one. Just realized I don't want that to be confusing. So all editable fields were put in orange, so staff could put prices in their community, as well as a purchasing unit under a master list. And then due to the magic of Excel, we realized this could be a lot more than just a generic price spreadsheet. By developing recipes within the spreadsheet, as well as places for staff to input certain information, we could actually create an auto-filling spreadsheet, which you see here, that'll auto-populate a shopping list, providing a standing order for local stores. So we've kind of attacked the budgeting issues, the costing issues, as well as potential shopping lists ordering standardized. Yeah, so people could kind of figure out how much funding do I actually need for the year and then put that in right off the bat. So to ensure the accuracy of the shopping lists, I built in various core recipes. We might budget for waffles, but if we don't budget for syrup, that can actually add up a lot over time, totally throw off your budget. Other stuff like soup stock, herbs, stuff like that are unintentionally discounted. And then you need to go, your shopping list is totally off. You end up having to go back to the store, and it also adds a lot to the budget. So building in recipes allowed us to take into account what was actually needed on a weekly basis. And it also allowed staff to see how different recipes compare in regard to price per serving. So you can see here, beef stew is a little bit less cost per serving compared to meaty macaroni and cheese. All they'd have to do on this page is put in the number of students they're serving and how many days a week they want to serve the recipe. So say you've got 50 students, you want to serve beef stew on Tuesdays. So you put it in 1 day a week. It will autofill that other page I had showed you with a shopping list and therefore budget. And the recipes actually came from the government of Nunavut. They're called core recipes, so they're cost-friendly and appropriate to northern communities. Takes out a lot of the guesswork. So you can also see in the bottom here, pages were split into hot recipes and hot purchasing, cold recipes and cold purchasing, and grab-and-go items. So staff can actually look at what suits them based on their capacity. For example, hot oatmeal, really cheap, as long as you have a bit of cooking space, whereas a smaller facility with no prep space is probably going to choose from grab-and-go. You don't need prep space, you don't need staff. You don't need dishes. So again, we're addressing capacity because we can't change the size of the school or the prep area, but we can at least make it much easier for you to figure out what is doable for you. So the government of Nunavut already had beautiful and lengthy lists of guidelines for the service of country food, but we realized it was really long. People weren't necessarily wanting to flip through it. So we actually condensed these guidelines into a 2-page chart that can actually be hung up in the food service area, while the full guidelines would still be available on the website to be determined by the government of Nunavut Communications Department. The guidebook already had a great food safety section, but it was quite wordy. So we added diagrams like the one pictured here, just to better explain kind of what we're looking for. We also developed a list of basic kitchen necessities, like what are your pots and pans, utensils, as well as required cleaning items based on information from the environmental health officer of what people need to clean. It was noted most of this would be needed for hot prep, whereas cold food service, you're not really going to need a lot of this stuff, and grab and go would require almost nothing. Lastly, we developed a scaling template to figure out how to adjust the government of Nunavut core recipes or anything else that's chosen based on how many people are they serving. So lastly, we come to kind of policy implications or suggestions. The big thing that came up was a lack of communication. It turned out Resolute Bay already had an amazing standing order. Clyde River already had costed sandwiches for a lunch program, and several communities had costed out staff, but no one had communicated any of this. Nobody had access to anyone else's resources. These are not uncommon issues. Canada has no federal school food program, and provincial programs are generally pretty piecemeal. This means a lack of consistency, a lack of resource sharing, and honestly, a lot of programs basically flying by the seat of their pants, which is more or less what was happening here. So in Nunavut, we actually have a Canadian prenatal nutrition program coordinator. So somebody is coordinating this program all over Nunavut. If we had something like that for school food programs, we could tie all these programs together, develop policies and guidelines, and help share resources, essentially developing putting together a provincial program out of the piecemeal that is already there. A federal program, which is definitely touched on a lot as a wish in a lot of the literature, can also help provide consistent funding, policy, and resources. So for policy, for example, some communities in Nunavut only serve students based on perceived need. This is also a thing in Quebec. Who decides this? It's kind of subjective. There's a lot of ways to misjudge that. A strong framework and policy development can help guide decision-making on who gets served, how to navigate things like allergies, and so on. And then all of this information can also be shared so that we're not trying to redevelop resources all the time when we already have access, or somebody has access to this. It's just a question of sharing it. Okay, and I think that's it. So thank you guys so much for listening, and thanks for everyone who supported along the way. Yay.